Hey there. Tonight, we're traveling far east, across the dust-covered plains of ancient China and up into the jagged spine of its northern frontier. But we're not visiting an emperor's palace or wandering silk-filled markets. We're climbing higher into the forgotten footprints of those who labored not for glory, but survival. Because tonight, you'll step into the worn sandals of a man tasked with building one of the greatest monuments in human history, and one of the most grueling, not as a planner, not as a commander, but as a worker, a nameless figure pressed into stone, wind, and silence. So find a quiet place, let the noise of today fall away, and let's begin. You don't remember when the order came, only that it arrived like a sudden wind in early spring. One day you were tending millet in your father's narrow field, brushing the dirt from your knees and swatting flies from your neck, and the next, soldiers. Their boots thudded against the cracked earth. Their faces were hard, unreadable. They didn't ask, they pointed. You were conscripted. No name needed, just a body, 2 hands, a spine still young enough to carry stone. Your mother cried into her sleeves. Your father said nothing. He had known this would come, had seen it in the eyes of other fathers before him. When the soldiers reached the village's edge, you looked back once, only once. Then the mountains swallowed you whole. The journey north took weeks. Hundreds of men, some boys, some gray-haired, walked in silence. Dust caked your throat, your feet blistered in straw sandals. You passed through valleys where the trees bent in fear of wind, and over ridges where birds no longer sang. At night the campfires were small and few. Food was rice mixed with gravel. Sleep came hard. There were whispers. Some said you were being taken to guard the empire's edge. Others said you were going to die with a chisel in your hand. No one said it out loud, but the truth coiled behind every glance. This was not service. This was punishment. By the time the first glimpse of the wall appeared, a thin, broken line etched across the ridges, you were too tired to marvel. It didn't rise proudly like the paintings in the scrolls. It slouched, half-built, crumbling in places, swallowed by forest in others. A scar in the land, constantly reopened, and you were here to bleed into it. They didn't waste time. On your first morning, before the sun broke through the haze, you were handed a wicker basket and pointed toward a hill. Stones, rounded, jagged, enormous, were to be hauled up by hand. No oxen, no carts, just muscle and rope and willpower. The overseer barked in Mandarin laced with threats. You understood only the tone. Don't stop. Atop the hill, others worked already. Dozens, maybe hundreds. Some in straw hats, some bareheaded and sunburnt. They looked at you without expression. Then they turned back to the wall and kept building. The stones were set with tamped earth and layers of sticky rice mortar. The method was crude but relentless. Fill, stamp, set, repeat. If a stone fell onto someone's foot, onto someone's skull, the wall didn't pause. Another body filled the gap. Another stone was laid. The air smelled of lime, sweat, and cooked despair. By the evening, your arms burned. You could no longer feel your fingers. The basket had dug deep furrows into your shoulders, and your feet were cut from a dropped slab. The blood soaked through your sandal, and no one noticed. You sat beside a stranger in the camp that night. He handed you a rice ball, said nothing. He was missing 2 fingers. You didn't ask how, because you already knew. You woke to the sound of the horn, deep, guttural, like an animal mourning in the dark. The sun wasn't up yet, but movement had already begun. Shadows hunched forward, tightening straw belts, lifting baskets, coughing into the cold morning air. There was no time for food, only the call of labor, urgent and unrelenting. Your hands throbbed. The skin had split at the joints, and your knuckles were raw. But when the overseer passed, shouting in that voice that could make silence shiver, you stood. The wall would not build itself. No one spoke on the climb up the ridge. The wind blew harder today, flinging grit into your eyes and lungs. The dust never left. It coated your throat, stiffened your clothes, and settled under your fingernails like it belonged there. You looked down once and saw a vulture circling far below. It wasn't looking for a rabbit or a fox. It knew where the dead would be. The section you'd been assigned to was steep and half-finished, the stone face leaning awkwardly into the slope like it might collapse backward. You worked in rows, hauling stone, mixing lime, spreading mortar. It was all rhythm, all repetition, the kind that made your mind float away from your body, a trance of agony. Around you, men groaned but didn't stop. The older ones moved slower, already hunched. Some had been here for years. Others arrived just a week ago and already stared with empty eyes. You learned quickly not to ask names. Too many vanished. Some ran, most failed. One man tried yesterday, slipped into the trees at dusk. His body came back by morning, dragged by his ankles through the mud, mouth stuffed with rice paste as a warning. The overseer didn't say a word. He just smiled. At midday, a small cart arrived. It wasn't food. It was more bodies. New conscripts, boys, criminals, debtors. The empire gathered its builders from every dark place. One of them couldn't have been older than 15. He was already coughing. "Which section?" an officer asked, scribbling on a bamboo slate. "Put them on the east rise. The slope needs filling." They'd die there. That part of the wall had crumbled twice in a month, and still you built. You packed stones into the belly of the wall, layering them with earth, tamping them down with wooden mallets until your arms screamed. Then more stones. The lime burned your skin. The wind cracked your lips. You felt the sun move like a god above you, watching without mercy. By sunset, your body felt like borrowed wood, splintered and brittle. But the wall had grown. An inch, maybe less. It didn't matter, because the wall didn't care. That night, you ate in silence. The stranger with the missing fingers sat beside you again. This time he passed you a strip of salted radish, a luxury. You nodded in thanks. He said finally, "I was once a carpenter." You looked at his hands. Not anymore. The sentence hung between you. Above, the stars blinked into place. The wind howled down the ridge, and somewhere, stone by stone, the empire kept building. Even with the bodies of men, even with their names forgotten, because the wall wasn't made to remember, it was made to endure.
It took nearly a week before the pain became familiar. Not easier, never easier, but predictable. Your muscles screamed in the morning, your back bent sooner each day, and your hands, once able to grip tightly, now trembled by noon. But your mind had changed. You no longer measured days by sunrise or meal. You measured them by how many stones you could lift before your vision darkened. And you were getting better at it. The eastern rise, your post, was shaping up. A jagged cut along the ridge, it was constantly under siege by landslides and wind. Each time a section collapsed, the overseers only grunted and ordered more men to the line. It didn't matter that the earth was unstable. The wall had to stand, whether by engineering or sacrifice. One morning, they sent down ropes. You were told to climb, not up the wall, down the cliffside behind it, where new stones had been spotted in a dry riverbed. You and 5 others, roped together like cattle, descended the sheer rock face with baskets tied to your backs. Below, the riverbed shimmered with white granite boulders, too large, too heavy, but no one argued. You learned that day what it meant to carry stone uphill in silence. The ropes cut into your shoulders. The wind pushed you sideways. Twice, someone slipped. One man cracked his knee. He couldn't walk after. The others left him behind. By dusk, you made it back, breathless and half dead, with a single block of stone. The overseer nodded. Again tomorrow. The boy, Lou, coughed harder now. He had blood on his lips. You could see it when he turned away. No one said anything. You'd all seen it before. The lung sickness came fast up here, where the air was thin and the dust endless. He worked slower. One evening, he collapsed beside the mortar pit. Not passed out, not dead, just collapsed, curled in on himself like a child. The overseer approached. Everyone stopped working. You held your breath. Instead of a beating, the man knelt and whispered something, then stood, walked away. The next morning, Lou was gone. Some said he'd been sent back home. Others saw him carried behind the camp, wrapped in canvas. You didn't ask. You went back to work. They told you the wall would stretch for thousands of li, from the edge of the desert to the forest's last tree. They said it would stand out invaders. They said it would stand forever. But here, where stone met blood, none of that mattered. What mattered was whether you could stay standing one more day, whether your fingers still gripped the rope, whether your feet still climbed the slope. You began to understand why some of the older workers hummed under their breath, not songs, but rhythms, to match their steps, to match the beat of their tools. It wasn't music, it was survival. One night, you awoke coughing, throat thick with dust and smoke. The sky above was red. A fire. The west camp was burning. Screams tore through the dark. You scrambled up the slope with others, but the flames rose too fast. Tents collapsed like paper. The wind fed the blaze. By dawn, it was ash. No one counted the dead. No one mentioned names. The overseers barked orders,
and work resumed, as if nothing had happened. The wall must continue. And so it did, with fewer hands, with heavier silence. But it grew, stone by stone, back by broken back. The ashes from the fire clung to everything. They blackened your tunic, turned your hands into soot-caked claws, and made the sky a permanent bruise for 3 days. You didn't speak of it. No one did. The men who hadn't burned were simply reassigned to other slopes. The tools they left behind were quietly taken by others. That's how it worked here. When someone vanished, his place was filled by a shadow, and the work rolled on like the mountain never noticed. But you noticed. You had begun to count ghosts. Not by name, names faded fast, but by the hollow places they left behind. The way a rice bowl sat untouched for a night. The silence where a laugh once lived. A song no one finished. The wall was full of them. The wind changed direction that leak. It now came from the north, bringing the bite of early frost. You wrapped your hands in cloth, but the cold crept in anyway, turning your joints stiff and heavy. You watched the men around you move slower, quieter. One limped, one dragged his foot. The boy with the twisted knee hadn't returned. Some still believed in going home. You didn't. You'd stopped counting the days. A new overseer arrived. This one didn't shout. He watched. Always. He had a thin scar that split his eyebrow and ran down into his cheek, and he never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He would stop beside you as you laid mortar, crouch silently, and run his finger across your work. If the line wasn't straight, if the packing wasn't tight enough, he didn't yell. He just stared. That was worse. One man, eager to impress him, tried lifting a boulder twice his size. He managed to hoist it up, staggering forward like a drunk. For a moment, everyone paused to watch. Then his foot slipped. The boulder rolled. The scream was sharp and short. The man's leg bent the wrong way. He didn't come back either. The overseer stared at the scene, then at you. "Back to work," he said finally. By now your fingers were permanently curved, shaped by rope and stone. The tips had grown calloused, thick as leather. You could balance a bowl of boiling water and not flinch. Your shoulders ached in your sleep. Your dreams were filled with dust and rope and the endless thump of packed earth. One evening, a letter arrived. Not for you, for a man 2 tenths down. He opened it with shaking hands. No one spoke, but everyone watched. Then he folded it, tore it in half, and threw it into the fire. Whatever it said, it hadn't changed anything. The wall still needed building. You heard rumors that in some parts of the empire, other stretches of the wall were being abandoned, that laborers were running away en masse, that rebellions were stirring in the west, that barbarians had found new paths through the mountains. None of it mattered here. Here, the mountain didn't care about news. It only knew the weight of stone, and your job was to carry it. That night, the moon rose full and low, lighting the ridge like a silver blade. You stood at the edge of the wall, staring down into the dark valleys below. Somewhere out there was your village, your mother, your name. But the wall didn't know those things. It only knew your sweat, your silence, and the ghost you were slowly becoming. By the time the frost began to harden the earth each morning,
The rhythm of work had become indistinguishable from breathing. No orders were needed, no prompting. You woke, you hauled, you stacked, you sealed. The wall grew higher while your back grew lower. No one called you by name anymore. And when you tried to recall your own, it came only in fragments, like a word heard underwater. One night, as the wind peeled across the ridgeline and stung the raw skin behind your ears, you sat by the dim orange glow of a dwindling fire and realized something horrifying. You were forgetting the sound of your mother's voice. It was slipping away, as if scraped smooth by stone and silence. A new group of laborers arrived the next morning, young, confused, still trying to understand why they were here. Some wore bright, threadbare cloaks, remnants of a life they had barely left behind. One had earrings, another still smelled faintly of perfume. You stared at them the way one might stare at travelers from another world. Their hands were soft. Their eyes searched the horizon for home. You already knew they wouldn't find it. You were assigned to help train them, not because you were strong or wise or favored, but because you had survived long enough to be considered dependable. You didn't want the role, but no one asked. The boy with the perfume tried to speak to you. He asked where the breaks were, how often food came, if he might one day go back. You only looked at him and said, "Keep your back straight, don't lose the rhythm." He didn't understand, but he would. The wall stretched beyond sight now. It snaked through the cliffs and valleys like a scar the earth could never heal. At night, you saw the torchlights of distant labor camps blinking like dying stars along the spine of the mountain. The scale of it was impossible to grasp, and yet you carried it in your bones. One morning, the cold took another man in his sleep. He had spoken the night before, laughed even, just once, a hollow bark at some crude joke muttered near the soup pot. But when the morning bell rang, he didn't rise. They didn't bury him. There was no time. They dragged his body behind the ridge, where the earth was too frozen to dig deep. A thin pile of stones was placed over his chest to keep the scavengers off. You didn't know his name. You never asked. Later that day, you dropped a stone. It landed wrong and rolled down the slope, tearing a deep path into the fresh-packed wall. The overseer, scar-faced and silent, walked up behind you. You braced for the strike, but it didn't come. Instead, he said, quietly, "Do you know why this wall must stand?" You didn't answer. Because when it falls, it will crush everything beneath it. Then he turned and walked away. You weren't sure if he meant invaders or people like you. That night, the wind moaned like a beast caught between sleep and hunger. You curled beneath your blanket of straw and stared into the dark. The fire had gone out hours ago, but you didn't get up to relight it. You were too tired. And besides, you could no longer tell if you were cold or just empty. You started noticing them around the 9th moon, those who vanished not from death, but from something quieter, something stranger. They were men like you, quiet, calloused, skeletal from work,
But one day they simply stopped responding. They stood beside you in the mortar line, lifting stones, passing buckets, but their eyes were glass. Their lips moved without sound. And then, one morning, they didn't show up. No one asked where they went, because deep down, everyone knew the wall had taken them. Not their lives, their minds. And that, in some ways, was worse. The boy with the perfume? He lasted longer than most. He had learned the rhythm, stopped asking questions. He wrapped his hands properly, didn't waste his breath on small talk, and carried twice the weight he once did. But one morning you saw him staring out across the valley, a strange look in his eyes. "Do you think they can see us?" he asked. You didn't respond. They, the ones we're keeping out. You didn't want to lie, because you weren't sure the wall was meant to keep people out anymore. It was starting to feel like it was meant to keep you in. That week, the rains returned. They came fast, like punishment. The packed mud turned slick. The mountain trembled. 2 scaffolds collapsed under the weight of soaked lumber, sending men tumbling down the cliffside like broken dolls. You ran with others to drag them out. One was breathing, barely. The other was not. The foreman barked an order. "Don't stop. Get back to the ridge. Use fresh ropes." The body was left in the mud, his boots stolen by sundown. By morning, someone else was hammering stakes where he had fallen. At night, the dreams became worse. You dreamed not of your village or warmth or escape. You dreamed of stone, endless stone, of walls so tall they crushed the stars, of carrying blocks that bled when cracked open, of voices calling your name, but not the name your mother gave you, the name the wall had chosen. Sometimes, in the deep hours before dawn, you imagined setting it all on fire, the scaffolding, the tents, the wooden tools, lighting a match and watching it burn into the sky. But where would you go? The wall wasn't just around you now. It was inside you. You spoke its rhythm. You bled its dust. And even if you ran, it would follow. You began to carve a notch into your sleeping post for every moon that passed. There were 17 now. 17 moons since your name was last spoken aloud. 17 since you'd seen a face that wasn't grimed with despair. 17 since you'd thought about a future. What would you even do if you were released? Go home? Would your mother still recognize you? Would you recognize yourself? Then, on the 18th morning, a messenger arrived. A man in red silk, riding a black horse with silver reins. He carried no tools, no grime on his skin. He spoke with the overseers for less than a minute. When he left, 3 names were called. Yours was one of them. You stood, trembling. Was this it? Freedom? Punishment? No one said, but the others stared as you gathered your things, some with envy, some with pity, and some with eyes already dead. You didn't look back. Not because you weren't scared, but because if you did, you knew the wall would never let you leave. Not really. The path down the mountain was one you hadn't walked since your arrival, and now, beneath the weight of silence and watchful soldiers, it felt like descending into a world that had kept moving without you. Each step was a betrayal of the rhythm your body had come to accept, the rhythm of stone, lash, and ash. You didn't ask where you were going. You'd learned long ago that questions had no purchase in this life. After a day's ride, you arrived at a small outpost, a barracks surrounded by reeds and mist, not far from a slow gray river. The commander, an older man with a face that looked boiled and re-stitched, welcomed you without warmth. "You've survived longer than expected," he said flatly, as if reading your obituary aloud. You nodded. "You can carry a load. You don't fall over in the heat. You know when to shut up." Again you nodded. He studied you, then handed you a scroll with strange markings you didn't understand. "You're being sent to the southern ridge," he muttered. "They need laborers who won't ask for their mothers." You blinked. You weren't going home. You were being transferred, recycled. The southern ridge was worse. Hot, dry, exposed. The wind didn't howl here. It scraped. It peeled. Every gust seemed to flay the skin from your face, and the sand found its way into your mouth, your ears, your joints. It caked in your sweat and turned your clothes into coarse leather. The wall here was younger, less stone, more scaffolding. You were a veteran now, no longer the lowest. But that didn't matter. They still screamed at you, still watched you eat, still chained the gates at night. You were placed with a new team. They looked at you the way the boy with the perfume once had, with naive questions hidden behind tired smiles. You gave them nothing, not even your name. It no longer carried it with pride. It was just one more thing the wall had carved out of you. One man caught your attention, though, not for his strength or his endurance, but for his eyes. They were sharp, not just alert, but calculating. He asked few questions, but watched everything. When no one was looking, he smuggled crusts of bread from the kitchen. When the guards rotated, he noted the pattern. And at night, he stared at the horizon, not in longing, but in measuring. Weeks passed. One night, that man woke you. His whisper was like a needle behind your ear. "We're going." You blinked. "Where?" "Out." You thought he was mad. But then he showed you the rope, knotted tight, the hook, the broken panel in the fence. He wasn't asking for permission. He was offering a chance. You hesitated. You'd seen men try before. One had been caught in the reeds, screaming as the dogs tore his leg open. Another had tripped on a loose rock and was found with an arrow in his back by sunrise. But this man planned. He waited. And in that moment, something in you cracked. It was small, quiet, but real. A tiny ember of the person you had once been. So you followed, into the night, past the sentries, past the ash pits, through the teeth of the desert wind and the claws of the cold. You didn't know where the path led, only that it wasn't here. And sometimes that was enough.
You ran until your feet bled. No, you fled. Because this wasn't escape. Escape is for men with choices. This was survival. This was desperation, cracking open your ribs and whispering, "Faster." The desert didn't welcome you. It pressed in like a closing fist. The sand slithered into your wounds. Your tongue swelled from thirst. Twice you fell. Once you nearly didn't rise. But the man, the one with sharp eyes and quiet steps, he pulled you up each time without a word. He moved like someone who had been running for a long time. And you began to wonder if he was ever caught, or if he had always been outside the fence, even while he built it. On the third night, you reached a gorge. Shallow, cracked, empty. He led you through it like a ghost. "Why here?" you asked, voice a rasp. He glanced back, just once. They won't follow into cursed ground. You thought he was joking, until you saw the bones. They weren't buried, just scattered. Skulls wedged between roots, ribs tangled in wind-worn cloth, femurs gnawed down to the marrow. Not fresh, but not ancient either. "What happened?" you asked. "Famine camp, 10 years ago. The wall took the grain, the villages were left to eat each other." You didn't ask more. You didn't sleep that night. By morning, he pointed to a ridge. "Cross that, you'll see the river." You stared. "And then?" He shrugged. "Then you choose." And just like that, he turned back the way he came. "Wait!" you called. He didn't stop. "You're not coming?" "I don't need the river." "Where are you going?" He paused, then smiled, just once. "Back?" "Back?" you echoed. "To break it from the inside." And then he vanished into the rising heat, swallowed by the very world he had just escaped. You watched the ridge for a long time, and then you walked. It took half a day to reach the river. You didn't cry, didn't collapse, just knelt at the edge, dipped your hands in, and drank until your stomach hurt. Then you looked up and realized something terrifying. You had no idea what to do next. No home, no name, no past. The wall had taken all of that. All you had now was this: a thin stream of water, a bruised sky, and the sound of wind moving through tall grass, as if whispering, "Start again."
You followed the river, not because you knew where it led, but because it moved, and movement felt like purpose. For 3 days you stayed close to the edge, sleeping beneath thorned trees and drinking only when the water looked still enough not to fight you. Your body was a map of pain, blisters gone wrong, skin burned from sun and wind, a cough deep in your lungs that rattled when the nights turned cold. But still, you walked. You didn't speak. To whom would you speak? The birds flew too high, and the fish fled before your shadow. Even the insects seemed to avoid you now, as if sensing the ghost forming inside your skin. On the 5th morning, the smell of smoke reached you. Not wild, not burning brush. This was cooking smoke, wood fire, faint, mingled with something sweet and strange. You followed it, moving low along the bank until the trees opened into a clearing. A camp. Not a garrison, not soldiers. Peasants. Maybe 20 of them, barefoot and thin, skin like old leather, and eyes that flinched at every gust of wind. They had a single cart, a donkey, two makeshift tents, and a collection of pots balanced on stones around a fire. You stepped into the clearing. No one welcomed you, but no one screamed either. That was something. An old woman eyed your feet, then your hands, then finally your face. "You've come from the wall?" she said, not a question. You nodded. Her face didn't change. "Then you're empty." You didn't know what that meant, but you knew she was right. A man handed you a bowl, root stew, thin and sour, but hot. You ate like a creature, not a person, and when it was gone, you sat by the fire and said nothing, letting the silence hold you. That night, they let you sleep near the edge of camp, not inside it, not among them, but near. The distinction mattered. These were people who had lost too much to trust what walked out of that desert. You didn't blame them. The next day, you worked. You helped mend a torn tent, fetched water, pulled stones from a patch of soil they meant to turn into a field. The labor felt familiar, not welcome, but known. You didn't ask to stay. They didn't offer. But when the sun fell, no one sent you away. That night, a boy, no more than 12, sat beside you. "My father built the wall. Then it took him." You looked at him. "I'm sorry." He shrugged. "We don't bury them anymore. Just say their names to the fire and let the smoke carry them." You said nothing. He leaned in. "What was your name before?" You tried to remember, tried to summon the syllables, the tone, the way someone used to say it when they called you home for supper or scolded you for missing prayer. But there was nothing. The wall hadn't taken your name. You'd given it to survive. "I don't know," you said. The boy nodded. "Then you get to choose." He stood and left you with that. In the days that followed, you stayed. No one asked why. You hunted with the quiet girl who never spoke, but always aimed true. You traded a weaving of grass and straw for a pair of shoes. You helped an old man pull his donkey out of the mud. You found small ways to matter. And one evening, as the fire cracked and the smoke curled upward, the old woman said, without looking up, "You should give your name to the flames now. Let it rise." So you did. Not your old one, but the one you chose. The one that meant, "I survived." You whispered it into the dark, and the flames danced higher for a moment, as if in agreement. And when sleep came that night, for the first time in months, you dreamed, not of walls, not of chains, but of rivers that never ended, and paths that did not lead back. It was weeks before the stranger arrived. He came from the east, walking with a limp and a bundle on his back wrapped in waxed cloth. He wasn't young, and he wasn't old. His face was a blade, sharp where it needed to be, dulled where time had worn it down. The camp saw him long before he reached it, and when he did, no one greeted him. He didn't expect them to. He simply sat near the edge of the fire circle and waited, not like a guest, like someone who already belonged. You watched him for a long time. His hands were calloused, but not like yours, not from stone and mortar. His nails were stained black at the tips, ink. He caught your gaze once, and when he did, he said, "You built it." You nodded. So did many others here. That was all he needed. At dusk, he took out a sheet of parchment, unrolled it gently, and laid it beside the fire. The children crept closer. You joined them. It wasn't a map. It wasn't words. It was wind, drawn in swirls, spirals, and threads, sketched like a storm in motion. Every curl had a mark beside it, mountains, valleys, water roots. "It's not the wall that divides," he said softly. "It's where the wind stops." The old woman grunted. "Poetry doesn't fill bowls." He smiled. "No, but it keeps men from choking on dust." You didn't understand, not yet. But you watched as he taught the children to trace the lines. "Wind moves memory," he explained. "The emperors build walls to stop it, but memory always finds a way through." That night you couldn't sleep. You stood by the river, watching it catch starlight like scattered silver. Behind you, the camp murmured in dreams. In front of you, the water moved on, not knowing your name, not caring where you'd been. And yet, for the first time in your life, you weren't afraid of where it led. The next day you asked the stranger, "Why come here? We're forgotten." He shook his head. "Not forgotten, just hidden. There's a difference." You paused. "What's the point?" He looked at you for a long time before answering. "Because someone has to remember what the wall cost." You nodded. Because you understood. You had lived the cost. When spring bloomed, soft and early, the stranger was gone. He left behind the parchment, folded into a square, tucked into your shoes. You didn't open it, not yet. But you carried it with you, wrapped tight in cloth against your ribs. Because now the wall lived in your bones. And one day, when your legs were strong again, when the children could walk farther than the edge of the field, when the stories were ready to be spoken aloud, you would leave, not to forget, but to carry the memory forward, past the wind, past the rivers, to the places where no one knew the word laborer without knowing the price of the stones beneath their feet. You would speak, you would remember, and in doing so, you would begin to build again, not walls, but bridges. You didn't leave that spring. Not because you were afraid, though sometimes you still were, but because the camp needed hands, and yours had learned how to shape, fix, carry. There were roofs to mend, grain to dry, and a child with a bad cough whose mother had vanished with the rains. So you stayed. And the parchment stayed with you. You didn't look at it until the third full moon, not until the coughing child stopped crying long enough to sleep, not until the seeds you planted began to push green from the dark earth like tiny hands reaching for something kinder. You unfolded the parchment by candlelight. The wind map was still there, but someone, maybe the stranger, maybe not, had added something in the margins. Small, careful symbols, each one shaped like a mouth, open, closed, half open. You traced them with your thumb. Not letters, not language, but song. The camp was quieter now, not because people were silent, but because they'd stopped fearing their own voices. You heard humming while people worked, short poems whispered to babies, even laughter, though it often came too fast, too sharp, like someone testing whether they still remembered how. You watched them build again, not for emperors, not under whips, but for each other. The homes had low walls, curved roofs, and wide doors. No one locked anything. There was nothing to steal that wasn't already shared. One morning, the river brought a new face, a girl, maybe 10, alone, silent, soaked to the bone. She had a scar over her eye, and the kind of stillness only survivors wore. You wrapped her in dry cloth, gave her broth, asked no questions. She sat beside you that night and pointed to the parchment. You nodded and said, "It's a memory of the wind." She looked at you and whispered something. You didn't understand it, but the sound felt right, so you whispered it back. And just like that, a bridge formed between you, a quiet one, a fragile one, but it held. Years passed. Your back bent further, your fingers stiffened. The wall still stood in the north, miles high, thick as a promise. You no longer dreamed of tearing it down, but you did dream of reaching past it. One day, the children asked where you'd come from. You told them. Not everything, just enough. How you built something that broke your body. How they fed you until you were too weak to run, then starved you until you were too afraid to stop. How you watched men vanish into mortar, their names buried in stone. And how one day you found a man who remembered the wind. They listened, wide-eyed, silent. And when you were finished, the smallest among them whispered, "We won't forget." You smiled, because that was all you ever wanted. Not revenge, not justice, just a thread through time, a line from one broken voice to another, a bridge. That evening, you climbed the ridge behind the camp for the first time in years. You stood alone. The wind moved through the grass, soft and slow. And somewhere far away, too far to see, you imagined the wall still standing, but it felt smaller now, because here you were, whole, upright, and finally, free. In the years that followed, your name faded, not from the mouths of the villagers. You were still the one who came from the wall, still the elder they turned to when storms threatened or when a child fell ill, but from your own memory. The name you were born with felt like someone else's now, a version of you that had once knelt in stone dust and broken rice sacks, who had once carried the weight of imperial silence on his back. That name had died on the ridge. What lived now was a different man, not softer, not weaker, just returned to something older than empire, older than walls. The seasons came in sharper now, winters longer, rivers wider, the moon sometimes red for nights at a time. The villagers whispered that the spirits were stirring, that the wind was shifting again. You heard it too. At night, it no longer sang as it had when you were young. It scraped, low and scraping, like a finger across old bone. You felt it in your ribs, in the way the trees bent toward the earth, not away from it. And then, one morning, the sky turned yellow. Not gold, not warm, sickly, quiet. The birds vanished, the animals too. You stood in the field and waited, and before the sun was fully up, the man returned. Not the same one who had led you through the gorge all those years ago. Older now, thinner, his eyes deeper, darker. But it was him. He bore no blade, no bag, just a long strip of cloth wrapped around his arm. On it were markings you couldn't read. He did not bow, you did not speak. Not at first. The villagers gathered. They didn't know him, but they knew enough to stay back. Finally, you said, "How far did you get?" He smiled without teeth. "Farther than most." And I saw the end of it. You felt your knees want to give. He continued, "The wall curves. It doesn't stop. It curls back into itself." "What does that mean?" He looked up at the yellow sky. "It means it's not a wall. It's a circle." You sat with that. A circle. Not a barrier, but a trap. Not to keep people out, but to keep them turning, over and over, generation after generation. Sweat, stone, silence. "I'm dying," he said. You said nothing. "Take me to the river, where it runs shallow. I want to go back into the earth on my terms." You nodded. The villagers followed as you carried him, slowly, gently, through the same trail you once fled down. The grass was taller now, the bones gone. The river was quiet. You placed him by the shore. He didn't ask for prayer. He didn't cry. He just breathed once, looked at the clouds and said, "It doesn't win if we remember." Then he let go. They buried him beneath a willow. You marked the spot with the strip of cloth he carried. And the next night, the wind changed again. Not harsh, not mournful, but slow and full. You stood outside your hut, watching the children run through the tall grass, their feet kicking up dust, their voices loud, unafraid. You remembered once building a wall so wide it blocked out the sun, and now you watched the sun set freely across a sky no stone could hold back. You closed your eyes, and for the first time in your life, you sang. You kept singing. Not a song from your childhood, not a hymn from the emperor's courts. This was older, wordless, a humming that rose from your ribs like steam from warm rice. The children stopped running when they heard it. Even the elders turned their heads. It wasn't loud, but it reached, like roots under soil. That night, one of the youngest boys came to your door. He didn't ask permission to enter, just stepped inside, barefoot, holding a stone in both hands. "This is from the wall," he said. You recognized it instantly. The sandstone, shaved smooth from centuries of wind, still bore a scratch, your scratch, the number you'd etched with a broken nail to mark your place in the line. The boy must have found it somewhere along the edge where the wall met the river and eroded like memory. "Why bring it?" you asked. The boy shrugged. "It hummed." You took it gently and placed it near the hearth. For a moment, nothing. Then warmth, not from the fire, from the stone, as if it had held on to your blood, your heat, your heartbeat, and it was remembering. More stones came in the following weeks. Children brought them. Old women found them in the riverbed. A hunter unearthed one near the base of a cedar tree, cracked in half, but still humming when it rained. The village gathered them, not for walls, not for weapons, but for remembering. They arranged them in a circle in the field. Nothing tall, just low enough to sit on, to rest against, to place food upon during the harvest festival. And when wind passed through, it sang, not always, but often enough. And people began to listen again, to the earth, to each other, to you. You grew old, not quickly, but steadily, the way hills settle into mountains and rivers carve new paths. You no longer walked as far, no longer rose before dawn, but when the wind shifted, you still stood at your door, eyes scanning the ridge, waiting. For what? No one asked. Not out of fear, out of trust, because some part of them knew what you had always known, that the wall was never just stone. It was a wound, a scar across the land, and scars don't vanish. They sink into story. One morning, the boy, older now, nearly a man, brought a scroll he had written himself. It told the tale of the wall, not as glory, not as conquest, but as hunger, as silence, as dust and ash and the hum that never left. He asked for your name, the real one. You told him, then added, "But write it small, not because I am ashamed, but because I was only one." He nodded, and he did. The scroll was placed in the circle of stones, not buried, laid open, for the wind to read. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the moon sits low, the villagers swear they hear something strange, not footsteps, not whispers, but the sound of stone shifting, like it's trying to remember the shape of your hands. It happened during the third winter, after the circle of stones began to sing. Snow blanketed the valley in sheets so thick, even the river stilled in silence. The trees bowed under frost, and the old roofs moaned with the weight of it. No one traveled that season. No caravans, no messengers. The village folded in on itself like a fist in cold. But just before the solstice, a horn sounded on the ridge. Not a hunting horn, not an imperial call. It was deeper, hollow, like a throat clearing after centuries of dust. You were in the garden when you heard it, bent low, brushing snow from the sleeping herbs. You stood slowly, joints stiff from age, and turned your ear to the mountains. The wind didn't lie. It never had. They were coming. Not soldiers, not lords, but men and women with shoulders shaped like stone, faces weathered like bark, and on their backs the unmistakable scars of binding, of lash, of labor. Wall builders, the ones who vanished. At first, the villagers watched from behind doors, unsure if these were ghosts or worse. But then, you stepped forward. You whose back once bled in the summer dust. You whose silence had turned into stories. You walked barefoot across the snow, never flinching, never blinking, until you stood before the tallest among them. His hair was gray now, but his eyes had never left the quarry. "I thought you went back," you said. He nodded. "I did." "Why return?" He looked over your shoulder, toward the stones, toward the children now peeking from behind fences, and he whispered, "Because it was never about breaking the wall. It was about building something else." They carried no weapons, only tools, not to destroy, but to plant, to mend. They stayed that winter, and the one after. Some dug irrigation channels from the river. Others taught the children how to carve new patterns in stone, not numbers, not names, but prayers, whispers etched into slate, buried beneath seeds, mixed with spring rain. And the soil softened. So did the people. The circle of stones expanded, not outward, downward, layers added with each season, a spiraling memory wide enough for the village to gather, to sing, to weep. And sometimes on the warmest nights, they sang your song, the one without words, the one made from breath and silence and time. When you finally closed your eyes for the last time, it wasn't in a bed. It was on the earth, near the edge of the circle, wrapped in a worn robe, head resting against the very stone the boy once brought you. The village did not mourn with noise. They sat in stillness, listening to the wind move through pine. And when the horn sounded again on the ridge, this time soft, distant, gentle, they understood. No one had died, only returned, back to the earth, back to the wall, not as labor, not as memory, but as seed. Spring came early the following year, not with trumpets or warmth, but with a subtle shift, the kind only those who worked the soil could feel. The river ran clearer. The birds returned a week sooner than they had in years. The frost melted without flood. And on the first day the blossoms broke open, the children uncovered something beneath the garden's northern edge. Stone, but not just any stone, old, deliberate, carved in the same fashion as the Great Wall. They ran to the elders, shouting of treasure or curse. But when the villagers gathered, they found not treasure, not warning, but a message, chiseled in precise strokes. This land is still ours, but now it listens. No one remembered placing the stone there. No one admitted carving it. But all who saw it felt the truth in their bones. The wall had not died. It had transformed. Where once it held back invaders, it now held memory. Where once it divided, it now echoed. Some were afraid. The old banners, those who still clung to empire dreams, said it was a trick, that stones could not speak, that slaves did not return to sow gardens, that the wall was still sacred, just misunderstood. But they did not live in the village. They did not hear the hum that rose from the quarry at dusk. They did not feel the way rain softened only certain corners of the ruin, or how wildflowers now bloomed in patterns, spiraling out from the place where the final builder had laid down his axe and disappeared into the mist. You were gone now, but your story was not. Children learned it not through scrolls or sermons, but through soil, through the gentle guidance of hands older than they could fathom, hands once shackled, now calloused with peace. They learned that the wall had not only been built by blood, but by names lost, by languages silenced, by grief buried under mortar, and that to rebuild anything, truly rebuild, you must first learn to remember it whole. In the center of the village, they placed a final stone, polished, warm from sun. It bore no names, no dates, only this: let no hand build what no heart can bear. And beneath it they buried your sandals, worn smooth by time, cracked where you once ran, not to escape, but to begin. And still the wall watched, not from atop the hills as it once had, jagged, immense, proud, but from within, from the seeds, the water, the silence, from every footfall that now chose not to conquer, but to stay.
Years passed. The wall still stood, of course. Not the entire thing, not the proud spine it once had been, but pieces, fragments of ruin, teeth of an ancient beast, half buried in grass and moss. But now those stones fed the village instead of starving it. The quarry had become a garden. The villagers tilled it gently, never striking deeper than the earth allowed. They planted rows between the old scaffold posts, which had rotted into soft, dark loam, spring onions, wild beans, taro, the kind of food that once would have been taken for rations, now harvested with songs, and always the whisper of wind against stone. Children were born who never saw the wall as a weapon. To them, it was a place of stories. They chased each other across toppled ramparts and used the mortar cracks as hiding places. When it rained, the youngest believed you could hear voices in the rivulets dripping from old watchtowers. "Who are they?" one girl asked her grandmother one night, curled beside the cooking fire. "Ghosts," the old woman answered. "Bad ghosts?" "No," she said, stirring the pot. "Just the kind that remember." The villagers began a ritual each autumn. They would walk the path of the wall, the part that still curled like a spine around the northern hills, carrying lanterns made from hollowed squash and paper. They didn't dress in finery. They wore work clothes, mud-stained sleeves, old sandals. They didn't walk in silence either. They laughed, spoke aloud, told stories. The story of the builder who fled and survived. The story of the sharp-eyed man who went back to burn the foundation from the inside. The story of the girl who planted grain in the shadow of a wall once meant to keep her out. No one was sure which stories were real anymore, but they told them anyway. And somewhere between the river and the final stone, they began to feel something deeper than truth: belonging. Because while empires rose and fell, and while maps were drawn and redrawn by hands with ink-stained fingers, there was one thing no one could take: the echo, the lives folded into every stone. Not kings, not generals, just hands. Hands like yours.
One night, during the rains, a traveler came to the village. Not a merchant, not a soldier, just a man with tired feet and a face that seemed stitched together by loss. He slept beneath the fig trees near the quarry, ate nothing but roots and broth. And on his third morning, he walked to the old marker stone at the center of town, the one with no name, and stood there for a long time, hand resting on its surface like he was listening for something beneath it. He didn't speak, but when he left, the children swore they saw him press his forehead to the stone and whisper something, a single word. They couldn't hear it, but they remembered how it made them feel. Like the wind had changed direction, like the wall, or what was left of it, had finally exhaled. And somewhere, in the deep places of the world, the last stone shifted and rested.
Winter was slower now, not softer. No, the cold still bit, and frost still crept along the edges of every rooftop by dawn, but slower, more deliberate, as though even the seasons were learning to walk with care in a place once ruled by haste and hunger. You stayed, not because there was nowhere to go, but because the land had given you back a name. Not the one carved into rosters or whispered by overseers, but one grown slowly in soil, shaped by kindness, carried by calloused hands who remembered not what you did, but what you endured. They called you elder, not out of age, but for memory, because you remembered the wall, not as a monument, but as a mouth that had devoured too many. You never spoke of your escape in full, only pieces, the river, the gorge, the man with sharp eyes. Some nodded like they had heard the tale before, though it was always someone else, another name, another village, another child who grew up to rebel against stone. Because this too had changed. The wall was no longer just stone and mortar. It was story, and stories, unlike walls, could move. A boy came to you during the first thaw. He was thin but not starving, dressed in patched robes, his feet wrapped in reeds. Not from the village, that much was clear. But he carried himself like someone who knew how to walk long distances without drawing attention. He waited until you were alone at the edge of the old quarry garden. Then he bowed. He knew him, he said. You didn't ask who. You knew. You saw it in the way he stood, shoulders half turned, ready to run. In the way he watched your eyes and not your hands, in the scar on his cheek that looked like a nail once driven too close to bone. He told you to find me? You asked. The boy nodded. You gestured to the stump across from you. He sat. And together, in that breathless silence only found between two people with shared inheritance, suffering, survival, soil, you began to speak. Not of war, not of rebellion, but of how to grow sweet root in shaded places, how to find dry firewood in a fogged forest, how to keep your spirit when the days feel like stone and the nights feel like smoke. Because that was what the sharp-eyed man had wanted, not vengeance, but continuity. The boy stayed through spring, helped mend roofs, drove stakes for a new fence, carried buckets for the elders too tired to make the walk. No one asked where he was from anymore. He was here. That was enough. And when he left, quietly, as most do, he took nothing but a satchel and a story shaped like a seed, one that he would bury somewhere else. Years passed, the garden deepened, roots tangled with old bricks and forgotten tools. The wall, or what remained, leaned a little more with each storm. But it didn't fall, not yet. And when the wind blew just right, some claimed they heard the clang of hammers from the past. Not cries, not chains, just the sound of hands working, as if even now the dead were still building. But not a wall this time, a memory. And what they built could not be torn down.
The boy never came back. Years folded over his absence like pages, and still, sometimes, you looked up at the sound of quick footsteps on the path, expecting to see his shadow outlined against the haze. But the path remained empty, always empty. Still, he had done what the others before him had done, what you yourself had done, taken the story and carried it forward. That was how the wall truly crumbled, not with fire, not with rebellion, but with remembering. Children now played where men once bled. The base of the old rampart, cracked and moss-choked, had become a place for games. They called it the Giant's Spine. They climbed it barefoot, raced to the top, imagined battles where no one died. You watched them from afar, their laughter light and sharp as birdsong, and you did not stop them. Once, a boy scraped his knee on the old stone and cried. His older sister wiped the blood with her sleeve and said, "Don't cry. This wall tried to eat us once. Now we make it carry us." And she hoisted him up and raced to the top. The wall groaned beneath them, not in protest, in memory. One day, travelers arrived, not soldiers, not rulers, not tax collectors, just men with scrolls and ink-stained hands. They came to sketch, to measure. They called it heritage. They said it must be preserved. They traced every crack like it mattered, wrote down numbers, whispered about structure and preservation, about dynasties and history. But not once did they ask how many died building it. Not once did they ask how many vanished beneath it. You watched them with quiet eyes. You said nothing. But later, you carved something into the base of the wall. Just 3 lines, hidden behind a stone you loosened with your hands. It took everything. We gave more. And still, we remain. Then you placed the stone back. Because this was your way. You aged. Not suddenly, like a roof beam cracking in storm, but slowly, gently, like silk yellowing in the sun. The village grew around you. The garden grew taller. The trees reached for heaven, and your body slowly sank into the earth. One winter, you could no longer walk the fields. By spring, you could no longer rise without help. You were not sad. You had seen enough. The children came to you then, not to ask for stories, but just to sit. They brought you small things, a flower with 3 petals, a smooth pebble, a piece of honeycomb. They didn't need your words, just your presence. You were the proof that someone had endured.
And then, quietly, one night, beneath a sky full of rain, you went still. No one wept loudly, no one screamed. They wrapped your body in the old cloth, the same kind once used for rice sacks and wall stones. They buried you near the garden, beneath the plum tree. No marker, just a ring of stones. And every spring after, that plum tree bloomed too early, as if someone whispered to it from below, "I'm still here. I never left." The wall still stands, not whole, but not forgotten, because you lived, and through you, so did those who never could. The stories didn't end with your burial. They never do, not truly. The children who once sat by your side grew into parents themselves. The garden you tended with cracked hands now stretched beyond the old fence, creeping up the hillside where the broken wall still slouched against time. And the path you once walked barefoot was now worn smooth by generations, feet that did not flee, but returned. They called that path the Builder's Way, not because it led anywhere, but because it reminded them that someone had walked it with purpose, even when the world offered none. One of the girls, Mei Lin, kept the garden after you. She was never your daughter, but she might as well have been. She had your steadiness, your refusal to waste a word when silence could speak louder. She built a small alcove under the plum tree, just a place to sit, shaded from the summer sun, the stone bench carved with waves and clouds. She told no one what it meant, but every morning she left something there. An apricot, a sprig of mugwort, a coin with no emperor's face. And when her own child asked why, she simply said, "Because someone once made sure we could wake up tomorrow." Time reshaped the village, as it always does. Clay gave way to brick, fire pits to stoves. But the wall was never demolished. They let it stand, cracked, overgrown, a skeleton of something larger. Scholars came and traced its bones, muttering dates and names, but none of them knew what it felt like to haul stone with open wounds. None of them asked why plum trees still grew near the burial mounds. Only Mei Lin answered once when pressed. "It was never about protecting the empire," she said. "It was about surviving the emperor." And far from the village, beyond hills and rivers and lifetimes away, the boy who had once crossed the gorge, the one who ran beside you, he never stopped walking. He became a myth in his own way, a traveler with no last name, a teacher who spoke little but listened long. Sometimes he built, sometimes he tore down, but always he planted seeds of memory, of resistance, of the truth buried under mortar and glory. When he died, he was buried in a place with no stones at all, just wind and sky and an open plain. But before that, he whispered a story to the child who sat at his feet, a story of a wall, of a woman, of blood made into roots. And that child would carry it on. Because this is how the wall finally ends. Not with fire, not with time, but with remembering. not of what it stood for, but of who stood through it.
You stayed near the river at first. It fed you with fish, small and bony, but alive. Its banks gave you roots and shoots you learned not to eat all at once. You built no fire, lit no smoke. You listened always, because silence was safer than any hiding place. You saw travelers once, not soldiers, not laborers, just a family, 3 figures on the far ridge, a woman with a woven basket, a man with a limp, a child who did not wave. They passed without seeing you, like ghosts, or like you were one. And maybe you were. Because who were you now without the wall? Not a farmer, not a name, not even a slave. You were what was left. But still, something stirred. Maybe it was the memory of the man with quiet feet and rebellion in his voice, or the way the wall had once loomed behind your eyes every time you closed them. Or maybe it was just the simple fact of breath still coming in and out of your chest. Whatever it was, it pushed you north, away from the river, into hills where the trees grew twisted and the rocks turned red with iron. You found others there, not many, but enough. Runaways, widows, old soldiers whose armor had rusted into their skin. People who had vanished from the ledgers of kings and landlords and overseers. People who built nothing now. Not walls, not monuments, only shelters, fires, ways to survive. You learned from them how to snare a hare without bait, how to make medicine from bitter leaves, how to tell a friend from a spy by the way they asked for your name. And over time, you gave them something, too. Not skills, not strength, just the truth of what it meant to build something that was meant to break others, of how stone remembers the hands that bled to lift it, of how the wall wasn't just a thing behind you, it was a thing inside you. They listened. They didn't ask questions. But one night, an old woman named G knelt beside the fire and handed you a bowl of millet. "You speak like someone who still hears the drums," she said. You didn't deny it, because the drums still echoed sometimes, dull and steady, like fists on bone. G smiled. "Then beat your own," she said. "Louder." That winter, when a patrol passed through, your camp scattered like ash and wind. But not you. You watched. You memorized their movements. You saw their weapons, their coats, the pattern of their march. You followed them for days, and when they slept, you slipped into their camp, not for revenge, but for something simpler. A map, a route, a name, a weakness. Because now you had something you hadn't dared name before, a purpose, not just to live, but to remember, to teach, to undo, one stone at a time. And one day, long after the wall had vanished from sight, a child asked you where you came from. You didn't say the province, didn't say the village, didn't say the name you no longer used. You only said, "I built the wall once." The child blinked. Why? You looked up, at the sky, at the horizon, at everything that came after. And you answered simply,
so no one else would have to. And the child nodded, not because they understood, but because they believed you. And that, at last, was enough. Years passed. The river changed its course, carving a new path through the hills. The trees grew thicker. The camp grew quieter. Faces changed. Children became runners. The old grew still. You remained. Not out of fear, not out of guilt, but because you had become something else. Not a fugitive, not even a builder. A witness. You carried stories like others carried wounds, hidden, heavy. Some nights they leaked out in whispers by the fire, or in the twitch of your hands when thunder reminded you of the stones cracking beneath your hammer. But mostly you held them. Until one day someone asked you to teach them how to lift stone. Not for a wall, for a bridge. A small one, across a stream. You paused, then showed them where to place their feet, how to brace their back, when to breathe. It felt wrong at first, then right. You taught others, too, how to shape wood, how to lash vines, how to read the earth before it swallows you. And though none of them knew what you'd once built, they followed your lead, not out of obedience, out of trust. You'd earned it, with silence, with time, with survival. One winter, the frost came early. 3 children fell sick. You carried one for miles to an herbalist who lived alone with her goats. The child lived. You did not sleep. For 2 days. When they thanked you, you only shook your head. "Don't thank me," you said. "I was only breaking the wall." They didn't understand, but they remembered the words. And later, when you weren't around, they carved them into a stone by the stream. We break the wall with every kindness. You found it one day, didn't touch it, just sat beside it until the sun dipped below the trees. That night you dreamed of drums again, but this time they weren't calling men to labor. They weren't echoing off the bones of the dying. They were softer, distant, like someone learning to play them for the first time. Children, free. In the dream, the wall was still there, stretching, winding, endless. But something had changed. Between the stones, flowers grew. Between the cracks, vines climbed. And in places, whole sections had fallen, swallowed by the earth, forgotten by maps. You stood before one of those sections and smiled, not because it was gone, but because it could go, one stone at a time. You awoke with tears on your face, but they were not tears of sorrow. You were old now, not weak, not broken, just full, like a river before spring. When the time came, you lay beneath the trees you had helped plant. You did not speak, you did not flinch. You closed your eyes and let the sky take you. And in the years after, when stories were told by firelight, and children asked about the old one by the river. They were told only this: they built the wall, and then they helped us tear it down.